Let's try to get started today. How are we all doing out there today? Everyone's excited to be here, right? All right. So I want to welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Today's discussion is going to be on really looking at diversity in a different way. So the important thing as we get started and go through the morning is just, I think here, obviously we're at a university setting and so forth, so I think most folks are probably open to the ideas that we're going to discuss today. But I think the important thing is just keep an open mind as we go through everything, and feel free to ask questions at any point. And we're going to do some interactive work together. We have a couple brief videos and some group work we'll do, so hopefully we'll get through the morning. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, pretty good if I turn it on, probably. There we go. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the cultural competency through intersectionality and the addressing model. We're going to discuss structures of privilege and discrimination, and we're going to try to discuss different steps we can take to advance understanding and promote effective communication. And so I'm trying to gear this talk in a way that's useful for faculty or for staff, folks that work in offices and so forth. I've done a kind of similar, use this model that we're going to go over today a little bit with students who are getting trained to become psychologists. So, again, it might be different than what your area is or so forth, but at the same time, I think it's applicable to a lot of different areas and fields and so forth. When I discover who I am, I'll be free. So we talk a lot about, when we talk about diversity, we talk about understanding others, understanding different cultures, different ways of thinking, and so forth. But I think a lot of times we neglect to really understand how important it is to really understand ourselves first, right? So you can understand how it can be difficult to understand someone else, someone from a different cultural background, different race, a different whatever, if we don't really know who we are. And so, that's what the focus of today is going to be really more on that area. We can only do so much in one session together. So we're going to really look at a way to kind of look at ourselves, and by looking at ourselves, looking at others as well. So that's going to be kind of the focus today. Oh, sorry, I went to the video too quickly. I'm going to show a little video in a moment here. Hopefully I'll be able to restart it again in a second. Let's go back. Okay, excellent. So we're going to watch a little video just to get the discussion going. So we'll watch this, a few minutes of this video, and then we're going to have a little discussion from there. Is there a way to fast forward the video? I don't have my laptop. Hello, tech folks? Can you fast forward to the 6 minute and 30 second mark? Sorry about that. Sorry, I didn't know that I wouldn't have access to the laptop or anything. I didn't plan that part out. Let me know if I have to hit play, or if you can just hit play from there. Either way is good.
A little bit about race tonight, or to be more precise, I want to talk about how we talk about race, how we engage in race conversations, and how we might get a little bit better.
All right, just let's cut the video then. Sorry about that. Not my plan. Can you hear me okay? All right. So that video is going to talk about really was how difficult. It was actually a really nice video. I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint of this afterwards, and you can have a look at it on your own. But it really went into how difficult it could be to talk about race, right? We've all had awkward moments, situations, difficulties, sometimes interacting with someone who's, people are different than us in different ways. And that video really went into some of the challenges of having those discussions, but how, the importance also of having those discussions. Obviously, here at Kane, we have a very diverse. We're very fortunate, I think, to have a very diverse population, both in terms of faculty, staff, and also, of course, students as well. So that obviously adds a lot of value cultural value to our jobs, our experiences, our work, and so forth. But it can also add on a layer of complexity, right? It can make things difficult at times. So obviously, I have a look. Can everyone see the cartoon okay? So I'll read it for you all. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, right? Please climb that tree. And can everyone see some of the animals over there? Right, you have a monkey, you have a dog, an otter, an elephant. So obviously the idea is that, the idea might be we're starting off on the same foot. The idea of, picking yourself up from your bootstraps, moving forward. But in reality, not everyone has that same advantage, that same privilege. And that's what we're talking about today, really, is knowing privilege, understanding privilege, and knowing how to work with that. So systems of privilege provide, clear over and also less clear advantages for some, and place many others in a lot of disadvantages. What kinds of systems of privilege exist? Thinking about ourselves here at Kane, I know these are just going to be difficult, challenging to talk about, but we're going to do our best to have that discussion, keeping in mind that we're all, as the video discussed, we're all we can see that we're all human and we all make mistakes, right? But I do want to talk about privileges, systems of privilege, and so forth. Let's start with that difficult, tough question just to get it out of the way right now. Here at Kane, are there systems of privilege? Are there people or groups who are more privileged than others at Kane, do we think? What do you all think? Yes, no, maybe? When we talk privilege, we don't need to talk about race per se or things like that. We're going to be talking about an inclusive way to look at diversity today. Race is certainly important. It's a very big factor in how our society separates and divides and looks at us, categorizes. But it's not the only way as well. Steve? Right, absolutely. Yeah, we have such a mix of students here, right? We have kids in the honors program who live in the area, who are tremendous students, who come from not just tremendous students, everyone is, but come from a very privileged background to excel. We have other students who are first-generation college students and don't always have the skill set, that historical knowledge to always as easily excel, right? So we have in terms of socioeconomic differences, we have some diversity. Paula? Sure. Absolutely, right? Everyone heard what Dr. Avioli just said there? We all come in with different, as employees, we come in with different levels of privilege. Some of us are administrators, deans, faculty, program heads. Some of us are contingent faculty. Some of us are full-time faculty and so forth. So that brings levels of advantages and also disadvantages to folks in that ladder as well. Good, that's a really good example. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. That's a great point. One I didn't think about, but yeah, on-campus student, that gets some advantages, right? That gets you inside in ways that other students might not. It allows you to connect. We know one of the great conquerors of graduation is student connectedness, right? That ability to feel comfortable and in place in your setting, and that's definitely an advantage for some of the students who live on campus. That's right. Absolutely, and certainly being a student leader, having the time and the privilege to do that, right? That's also a big up as well. So yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts? Oh, Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You can be a first generation student and not have that background, but you can also be a first generation student from a more well-to-do family from another country who came over here because they had the opportunity to come over here, which is different than someone who came over here without the choice per se, right? So, mm-hmm. And they don't, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Great, thank you, Lydia. Other folks, other thoughts? Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at these different forms of privilege in different ways. So I think it's easy for us a lot of times to look at privilege in one or two different ways, but we sometimes forget it's difficult to see the hidden side, right? The other forms of privilege that do exist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my profession, then we're going to kind of transition into some small group work in a moment. So I'm a psychologist. As a psychologist and as a trainer here in psychology and also working in the field as a psychologist, it's very important that I understand these differences. And for all of us as psychologists, I see a couple of psychologists out in the audience, and other therapists, other social workers and other therapists as well. It's very important for all of us to understand our privilege and to understand different types of privilege so we can be effective in our job. So lack of awareness of cultural differences can make some of our work inaccurate or even harmful, right? So if we're working for someone from a different background, that could be different racial, ethnic background, but it can also be disability background, a different social class, was mentioned earlier. Those types of differences we need to be attuned to so we can most accurately look at, understand, and conceptualize who we're working with and how we're working with them. I give you some examples from our work as a psychologist or in the mental health field in general. So a lot of the tools that we use in our work are relatively culturally biased. They're based on a Western-centric model, perspective of doing things, and they can leave out a lot of worldviews or perspectives that differ from that quote-unquote norm. So, for example, the DSM-5, people familiar with the DSM? I see a few hands went up, right? So that's a I'm glad to see not all hands went up. That's good. The tools like the DSM, different psychological tests, whether it's IQ testing, the WISC, tests like that, or other also personality tests are very attuned to this challenge as well. They tend to be based. People try to test and retest these tests to norm them to make them accurate and so forth. But ultimately, they're based on Western ideas. They're based on Western-educated, middle-class ideas too often. So again, that can lead to misdiagnosis of a lot of folks who don't fit in that quote-unquote mold. Obviously, just our own potential bias as psychologists, as people. Unfortunately, we tend to, as a whole, as a class, be, not of the mainstream in many ways too, right? So, I mean, we're of the mainstream, but we're also very privileged in a lot of ways. And that can allow us to also perhaps look at things and behaviors or other symptoms in ways that may not be accurate. And just overall, it's easy for us, especially if we're from a privileged racial ethnic background and so forth, to look over different modes of racism and discrimination that do exist. Question? Mm-hmm.
Which is more internationally based. So would you consider that as also a biased tool or not?
I do. It's used here in the U.S. too with insurance and other places a bit too. It's often very interchangeable as well, with some differences. But yeah, I put it down because it is still a Western-centric model based on a European type of framework, so yeah, I would still put it in there. Some differences, but also a lot of overlap too. Great though, good question. Other questions? So you can see in my work, and as a psychologist, and for others who are in the mental health field as well, our work is prone to bias, right? It's prone to these types of mistakes that can happen. And that's why having that awareness of challenging ourselves all the time is so important. So how is this lack of understanding of privilege, how can it impact you in your work? So let's try to do a little group work here together. We have a good sized group, I see, and I see. Let's try getting in groups of 2 or 3 if we can. This would all. We're going to do something. We're going to continue this a little bit later with another group exercise. So it would really work best if you're not too familiar with people who you're working with. However, I understand people are sitting together and no one wants to get all the way up sometimes. So, yes, the idea is take it into account here. We want to be fully supportive. So just try to get someone who you can get with. 2 or 3 folks is ideal. If you can work with someone else, great, but if not, I'll overlook it. It's okay. So what we're going to try to do, I see great conversation happening already. That's awesome. Let's try to come up with a list, just a short list. You can do write it down, or we can go the less hardworking approach of just keeping it in our minds. Try to come up with a list of 3 to 5 examples of how lack of understanding of systems of privilege and discrimination can impact your work experience or others. So just again, when we talk about discrimination too, let's keep in mind the more broad perspective on that. We're going to be going over a model that gives you an example of that. The thing about discrimination broadly, it's not just race or ethnicity, not just being sexism, things like that. Thinking about disability, a whole range of potential areas of discrimination, right, of privilege. All right, everyone. Just went around kind of quietly and kind of a stealth way. I went around the room a little bit. How are you all doing? Hello? Hello? All right, sorry to interrupt. I'm hearing some great conversation, so I do apologize. Everyone hear me okay? Do apologize for interrupting that. So again, we were talking about our different systems of privilege and discrimination that exist in our workplaces and so forth, and that impact our work in different ways. I heard some great conversations going on and ongoing, and I'd love to hear some of those. Anyone want to share what their group discussed? Maybe we can kind of go around and see if anyone wants to share. Any? Go ahead. Hold on. We got to quiet down a little bit. I apologize, folks. Do you want me to bring? You want to go ahead? Wasn't there, right? That's a great point. Everyone hear that? So a lot of times our students come from maybe from high school and prior academic backgrounds that aren't always as supportive of giving those skills for the kids that they need to get ahead. Not that our students can't get ahead. They're all very talented and hardworking folks, just clearly by getting here. But sometimes, unfortunately, I showed you that cartoon earlier. Remember with the different animals trying to, and the idea was a race. First exercise, climb to the top of the tree, and you had an elephant and you had a monkey, right? So who's going to win that race? Who had the background to win that race up the tree? The monkey, right? So likewise, unfortunately, sometimes folks just get more privileged in terms of their educational background to begin with, so they're off to a much quicker head start, right?
One of the groups we talked about was the international student, both linguistically as well as practical, the visa and whatnot. They come with a whole host of hurdles that they have to jump through as well.
Absolutely, that is actually a layer of privilege that many of us in here are fortunate to have, is not having to worry about our status, our visa status, and so forth, and that's a big challenge for a lot of folks. Go across the room over here.
Sometimes I also hear a lot of conversations among faculty because of our associated privileges as faculty. And we tend to look down on our students without spending time talking about what are their experiences and the incredible resources they bring to this institution.
Thank you. Everyone heard that comment? Right? I think that is a form of privilege that we too often do have. We have to acknowledge our privileges as faculty or staff, that we had a lot of things that helped us get here also that not all our students have, while our students have other tremendous assets that can help them as well in different ways. Other folks want to share thoughts that your group came up with? Go to Kendall and then we'll come over here.
We talked about religion and holidays that are observed or not observed and then acknowledged by the institution. So in particular, Jewish students who are observing their holidays, they have to navigate it for themselves, how to make up the work they're missing, and their programs are still going on without them.
That's a true point, right? I mean, again, we think even in Judaism, but we think about other religions out there that we don't even acknowledge. They could probably have that many more hurdles, I think, to go through in ways, right?
One thing that we talked about was the lack of understanding within our workplaces about what the other professional is doing. Our degrees, where we went to school, what we do, why we're in the profession, and that can create a schism within the department.
We don't think about that, right? Sometimes our own background might be different from someone else's, and unfortunately, that is can be a sign of privilege too.
We were talking about how English is a kind of privilege, and those who don't have a command of English are at a distinct disadvantage.
Everyone heard that comment? So again, just having that English language background for our students who aren't, don't have English as their first language, the actual the extra work, the disadvantage that can place them at in a lot of ways too. Let's go to the back. I see two of my communication folks, friends, back here. So
we were talking about different communication styles. Like some students can be very expressive, some are more quiet, and how our teaching styles and how attention goes to which group. I mean, that's an important factor that I've noticed in classes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Sometimes, some of our students who are from more privileged learning backgrounds, they know how to advocate for themselves in different ways, right? And so that can give them a foot forward in knowing how to speak up in class, when to do so, when to seek help, the issues like that as well. So again, that is another form of advantage of privilege as well. Terrific conversation. Thank you. I want to go into a way to kind of organize all our different thoughts today. So we've been talking a lot about different ways of understanding privilege and lack of privilege, discrimination, and so forth. And it's very important, but at the same time, it gets a little muddy sometimes, right? Has anyone noticed that? Sometimes it's not always, privilege, lack of privilege, these things are not always quite so clean cut as we would like. They're not always clear to us. They're not always right there for us. We need to figure out ways to make it more accessible to us and to others, these different levels of privilege and so forth. So what I'm going to share today is a more general framework first, and then from there I'm going to share a specific framework that's been used in psychology a little bit, and hopefully that's a way for us to better understand privilege and so forth. Everyone, can you all see that okay? So it's a definition for intersectionality from an awesome article that I'm going to share with you all in a moment or two. Not really that awesome, but I co-authored it, so I pretended to make it awesome. But intersectionality recognizes that individuals can be privileged in some ways and not privileged in other ways. For example, President Obama was privileged to be born into a family that promoted learning and intellectual curiosity and had the socioeconomic opportunity to allow him to develop within a variety of different contexts and cultures and countries and so forth. However, President Obama was not privileged in terms of his racial ethnic background. Intersectionality recognizes that privilege can accrue in certain domains and not in others, making this perspective a suitable one to examine individual differences. Right? So what this perspective says is that there are certain areas that so-and-so people are privileged, certain areas that people are not privileged in. Right? And it tries to look at the person as a distinct whole instead of just trying to look at one or two different areas. So this is a framework that came up in women's studies in the 90s as a way to kind of articulate gender differences and so forth. And it's kind of gotten a little bit wider use. Not so much in psychology quite yet, but I think it's starting to permeate in there as well. We're going to start a video now. This is a 2-minute video. This video will just be the first 2 minutes we're going to watch. So.
The work that I do is rooted in a practice of disability justice. Disability justice is an imperative of intersectionality. Disability justice is the art and practice of honoring the body. Intersectionality, as coined and intended by the Black feminist and womanist scholar activist Kimberly Crenshaw, is the deliberate thought and practice of understanding that oppression comes in multiple forms that do not simply add together 1 + 1 as though you can check them off on a box, but rather inform one another, creating new and particular experiences of oppression that cannot be easily conceptualized by linear narratives. This is oppression that for many of us, we live in our bodies. I ask us to tune into our bodies because to honor the body means not just the abstract or the theory. We have invited certain people to this room. We respect certain people. We attempt to use inclusive language, whatever the hell that means. But it also means the art of honoring the body that we occupy, allowing ourselves to exist and to take up space, to affirm that those who are the most vulnerable, the most traumatized, the most impacted are valuable and valid and magnificent and beautiful.
Intersectionality model does, it tries to look at privilege in different realms, right? So what we're going to do in a moment, we're going to go into a model of that. But first, though, let's try to get back into our groups very briefly and just try to come up with a definition of intersectionality. So again, working with the folks you just worked with a moment ago, try to come up with a brief definition of your own for intersectionality. Okay, just take just a minute or two. This should be a short exercise. All right, we'll come back. This was a brief one. We're going to do a little more work again, one more at the end. But what I was asking is for folks to come up with a definition of intersectionality, their own definition within their group, and what they can now share with the rest of the folks. Any volunteer want to start us off with their definition? Karen?
We defined intersectionality as understanding how your greatest shortcomings can be your greatest strengths.
Did everyone hear that? So what we got, our first definition are, looking at how our shortcomings can be our strengths. That is definitely a way to look at it. How else? Thank you. How else can we look at it? A definition for intersectionality. Who has a definition they want to share? Any other group want to share their definition?
We came up with cross-cutting identity factors, both privilege and disadvantage, which create a more complex sense of self.
So looking at that complexity across different interpersonal domains. Good. Let's do one more, and then we're going to kind of move on.
Thinking of it from an sort of an educational assessment standpoint of high proficiency versus limited proficiency and strengths versus not deficit areas, but more areas to be further developed.
Further refined, right? Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. Great definitions. Sometimes further refined, but not always further refined, too. It depends on what we're discussing, right? But certainly different, looking at human complexity, I think is a good way to look at it. Very good way to look at it. And looking at ways to understand that human complexity in all its different forms. Yes? Yeah, that's good. Did everyone hear that question? A really good question. Is this idea of intersectionality we're talking about, is it a descriptor of how things are or a descriptor of how things ought to be, in essence, right? We're looking at it as how things are in this case right now. We're using this as a way to look at understanding. Again, I use this as a psychologist to try to understand the client or the person I'm working with. We can use it as, regardless of if we're a mental health worker, if we're working in an office, just understand the other quote unquote. But certainly, I think canon is used in that kind of future-oriented manner as well. But we're looking at it just to try to understand better. We're in that self-exploration phase today, so that's kind of how we're using it. Great question, though. Thank you. Did that clarify what you're... Yeah. Other questions before we move on? Yes. Oh, please, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, thank you. And that's a great. So it can be looked at both ways. I think both as who the person is, what's going on, but also as the great potential they can be as well. Their human potential, understanding that human potential as well. So today's focus is more on just understanding the other, but certainly it can and should be used in that kind of perspective as well. So thank you. Anyone else want to add to that or? Terrific. Thank you for adding that. So I want to share with you the addressing model today. This is a more specific way to look at intersectionality. So intersectionality, as we were just discussing here, it's a great perspective to challenge our kind of dualistic beliefs, our kind of chromatic way of looking at things, but at the same time, it's this framework that, again, people looked at it in different ways, but it doesn't always have that clarity also to it. And in a lot of ways, that's actually, in a lot of different reasons, that's actually a really good thing, and it doesn't. It allows, if you're looking at area studies or different ways of looking at intersectionality, not having that, it allows for a more broader perspective. In this case, because we're trying to focus on understanding the nuances of others, I want to share a more specific model with you for that purpose. Keeping in mind, again, intersectionality can be looked at in a lot of different ways and should not only be looked at for this kind of descriptive purpose that we're doing today. Fair enough? Okay. So I want to talk about the addressing model. It's a model that we have in psychology and then for other mental health professionals as well. And what it does is it tends to the complexities of one's identity. It's not fully inclusive. You're going to see there's a lot of holes still in it. But it is one approach to better understanding others, I think, better understanding individual differences and so forth. So I'm going to get into each of these areas briefly, and then we're going to do an exercise together afterwards. But you can see the addressing model, it actually, if you look at those letters there, they're each an acronym, right? So they stand for different areas of diversity, if you would, different areas of individual differences. We'll go into each of the specifics right now. But again, it's a nice framework to remember these, right? So you can just remember addressing. So addressing the A in addressing, the first letter is age or generational differences. So looking at age in the context of personal and cultural history, considering age cohort influences, how it impacts the person's development, and worldview, understanding, and so forth. Understanding the context of the person in terms of their age and immigration status, country origin, and so forth. And asking questions. What does it mean for this person in this age, in this context, in this time, at this time in the world, right? It's quite a time we're living in right now, isn't it? And obviously people are going to have different perspectives on that based on their own age and so forth. So age is an area we need to keep in mind, right, about differences. Okay, the first D, there's two Ds, developmental or disability born with. So people are going to have disability that they're born with as compared to a disability that's acquired later on, all right? Why is that important to differentiate between those two? What do you all think? Why is it important to differentiate between someone who's born with a certain disability at birth as compared to someone who experiences some sort of injury or something later in life that has a disability? Yeah. Right. It can be much, if something if it's a disability that you're born with, you're gonna have that understanding from throughout your entire life, right? If something came on for different, whether it's a traumatic brain injury, maybe multiple sclerosis or something that happens later in life, that's gonna be something that's gonna be an adjustment. That could be, people are gonna handle that and see that in different ways. So that's important to differentiate those two because they're gonna impact someone's development, worldview, understanding, and so forth in different ways. Again, the second D, disability acquired later in life. We just discussed that. Dr. Marks, you wanted to add something to it?
One other thought. I think part of mental case
and there's reasons for that, I think. I mean, if you look actually at the data, a lot of the data we have about resilience, we know people that do have some sort of disability later in life, they're often very resilient to that. So you look at someone who has some of the most horrific things you can think about, a car accident, an injury, a brain injury that caused paraplegia or things like that. Research that even after these life-altering changes, where the body doesn't recover fully to the way it was, you see usually within 6 months to a year, you see an almost full recovery for a lot of people from this. So I think that's one of the historical reasons. But nonetheless, I think even if someone does have that type of injury, I think that it still certainly impacts their worldview, their understanding, and something that we should be mindful of and try to be aware of as well. Right? And so again, I think great point though. Great point though. So that's a D. So going to R, area that came up earlier in discussion, I think by Dr. Marks brought it up briefly too, about religion. Religious spirituality, or actually I think it was Kendall, right, who brought it. So obviously we psychologists, at least in my field, tend to, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but often are not always that religious, or maybe have a different spiritual background than their clients very often. So understanding one's spiritual orientation and how that impacts their worldview, their understanding, and so forth. And so that's a question that we need to ask. A lot of these questions, some of these questions are clear and easy to ask. Some of these areas we're going to be going over with this addressing model, whether you're a therapist, a psychologist, and so forth, a psychiatrist, whatever, or whether you're working in an office or as a student affairs office or residential life housing, things like that. Some of these questions are easy to ask, some of them are not so easy to ask. But they really help us understand the whole person. Right? So religion, spirituality, obviously that's important to understand. The E in addressing ethnicity, ethnic identity. So these things seem so clear, but they're not always that clear. For example, I italicized the race and ethnic groups we have here. I did that just because I want to highlight that I use the U.S. Census to highlight these different groups. Now, a lot of folks are not going to have disagreements with the racial and ethnic groups that I have up here. And I shared one with you, for example, a Pew Center study. 2/3 of Hispanic adults say Hispanic is their racial background. According to the U.S. Census, that's not even recognized. Right? The U.S. Census does not recognize being Hispanic, Latino as being a race at all. What's that? Yeah, it's not. But 2/3 of Hispanic Latinos consider themselves their race to be Hispanic, nonetheless. And so we need to be aware of that, and how people consider themselves, because that's what really, for us, whether it's working as therapists or working in an office and so forth, what matters is not what we think is how something should be categorized or someone should be categorized, but what they think. Right? Question?
One of the areas of controversy with race and ethnicity is the lack of identification in Middle Eastern and Northern African individuals. It creates an invisibility to mental illness. In fact, I think the 2020 census will change this, but they're recoded as white. And that creates problems when you're trying to study barriers to treatment, compliance. It's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes you. I'm half from Egypt, my family, and I know for myself personally, I always put down white in the census, but it seems a little odd sometimes. I go around, my grandparents, their first language is Arabic; it wasn't English, and so sometimes it feels a little odd to not have that representation out there. And so I'm sure other people have those kinds of experiences too. And I brought up the Hispanic example a moment ago, but there's many different examples with that kind of issue. So again, you can see models like this, they get at what's going on, but they still don't fully we're still not fully capturing diversity. Right? We're trying, but we're not still not fully there. So the S, we're getting towards the second half now. We're almost done, folks. Don't worry. S, social class. This came up a few times. I remember Steve started off our conversation today bringing up social class, socioeconomic status, and so forth, and how important of a factor it can be in the lives of our students and how they prepare and orient themselves and so forth. And social class is a big issue, and it cuts across all these different levels of diversity that we've been talking about today. All right? Next is sexual identity. So again, how does one's sexual orientation and identity, how does that impact them, their beliefs, their worldview, their perspectives, and so forth, all right? Indigenous heritage is an area we don't talk about quite enough. Folks who are Native American, Alaskan, indigenous folks have very unique cultures and worldviews. I was very fortunate, I was younger, to volunteer for a while and get to work in a behavioral health center with a Native American group in the Southwest. I can just tell you, it's not just religion per se, it's not just race, there's so much to the cultures, Native American cultures, that make them so distinct and so unique. How do we capture that? How do we understand that? Right? Then we're getting towards the end here, national origin. So again, this is the issue that came up earlier, we discussed a little bit earlier briefly, especially in this day and age now where we see travel bans and all these other things going on. This is a big factor for a lot of folks, including a lot of our students here at Kane. So we need to be aware of that, how that impacts, you know, their orientation towards class and work and so forth, and how that impacts their lives in general. And then finally, we made it to the end of the model. Gender, right? So gender we need to keep in mind as a social construct, but it has a very strong influence on how we see ourselves and our relationships and so forth, right? And again, transgender individuals, we had a great talk on that yesterday. But understanding folks who are transgender, their needs as well. So you can see this model kind of looks at a lot of different areas and tries to account for a lot of diversity in its model. Now I have Dr. Kaplan has handed out an article. I have 30 copies of an article I printed out. I think we have more than 30 people here. So what we'll do is maybe groups of 2. We should be good, hopefully. We'll see how this works out. How are we doing with time? So since we're going to do this in groups, maybe just give it to each group, give a copy. So the article, there's a couple pages to this article that you're going to be getting. Hopefully we'll have enough. I do apologize. I didn't know we get this many people. I did a talk 2 years ago. It had many less people in attendance. So basically what this article does, it's kind of like this exercise is going to guide you through using the addressing model. It was when I wrote it, we wrote it in the article originally in a journal for practicing psychologists, but this can be used again for yourselves in your work in whatever office you work at, or whatever department you're in and so forth. So if you go to page 33 of the article, does everyone have a copy? How are we doing? Are we short? It's still coming. They're still coming around over here. So you know what? Maybe I'll try to get it online. I'll show you. It's only one page I really need. I'll try to put it online too. Let me try to do that. Oh, actually, I don't have my computer. Never mind. I can't do that. They have control. I apologize. Okay, we need some over here too on this side. Awesome, awesome. I work part-time in New York, but it's a lot easier to get license in New York than New Jersey. Can I make more copies? No, that's it. Okay. So I do apologize. I guess we're out of copies. No, if you have one more, maybe you can give it to the folks over here. Right here, Dr. Kaplan. Oh, sorry. I tried. So if you don't have a copy, If you don't have a copy, there's many groups here that do. You can maybe percolate yourself towards one of those groups. I do apologize. So since we're doing these in groups instead of, this is designed originally to be done individually. So maybe as a group, what you can do is following the directions. Think of someone, either you as a group, your group wants to work out, or you yourself individually think about a person you want to do this exercise with, if that makes sense. I'm going to kind of go around the room, so please raise your hand with any questions. I've never tried this large of a group, and certainly not with not having enough articles available. Yes. Yes. So, starting right here. So basically, what we did is we have the addressing model there, right? And so what we want you to do is, what's that? You can apply it to yourself, or you can apply it to a colleague or a client. You're as a counselor, right? Think about a client you have or someone like that, and look through each of them. And the first thing you're going to do is say yes or no. There's a space to do yes or no. Is that an area of privilege? So if your client's 82, that's an area that's not a privilege. That would be a no, right? Because they're older. Yes. Sorry.
Does the client fill out something like this themselves, or does the counselor, psychologist, whoever, sort of fill it out?
I would have
for the client.
I would kind of just have a running narrative with the client when I do it with the client. In areas that you're not sure about to begin with, you can bring that to the discussion. So let's say I'm working with you, and I know your your basic age generation. I know your ethnicity. I know certain things about you. I don't have to bring those up per se. Then the areas I may not know about, I can just say it. I can bring up to ask you, just to learn as a way to kind of learn more about you as a client.
You may not know, but I think you might look at someone and say
they're healthy.
Or they're not in any indigenous background, and then it's like, well, yeah, my great grandmother was Cherokee.
Yeah. Well, whatever it is, absolutely. That's a good point.
So I think I don't know. It seems kind of dangerous. Because then I think in class, if you're talking about privilege, the students will make a lot of assumptions about me as a professor until we start discussing, I was first generation college, where I was raised, and women that I like. Again, you make presumptions.
But that's, I'm talking about erotic attraction. There's no erotic attraction.
And then hopefully they'll break down those presumptions. Hopefully. Any folks have any questions about this? Again, I do apologize. We don't have enough articles. I'm just going to kind of go around a little bit and bug you all. So if you have any questions, please stop me. All right, everyone, thank you. I think we had some really great ideas here. We had some folks who took photographs and other creative ways of sharing the paper and the model with each other. So thank you all for doing that. Thank you for taking the time to look over this model that I created out of a model as well. So I want to kind of go around. I know this is difficult for a lot of reasons. We didn't have enough articles, blah, blah, blah. You can yell at me and whatever. But at the same time, I want to try to discuss the model that we used here and see if it was helpful to folks or it could be potentially helpful. So there's different ways to use it. So I just want to hear from a few folks on how they conceptualize using this model for clients or students or colleagues or whomever.
We use the model to classify Donald Trump.
We had a Donald Trump class.
He's in 10 dimensions. He has high privilege in 9.
Okay, did everyone hear that? So they use this model in this case on President Trump, and they found President Trump is privileged in 9 areas and less privileged in 1. What was the area that he was less privileged? Okay. He may also be on the age. He may not be in the privileged area for age, too. So that might be 2 areas, actually. Yeah. So he may have a mental acquired disability, you're saying. And okay, well, thank you. That was a creative use. Who else wants to share how their group kind of used this model, conceptualized the model? Excuse me. Oh, great. I will paraphrase. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other areas, yeah. Everyone heard that? Thank you, a really great response. So what you're saying is that, this is helpful to this group to understand each of their areas of privilege and lack of privilege. And even for folks who kind of got to know each other a little bit here today, it was still a helpful way to really understand the overt and more hidden forms of privilege that we all have. Other folks want to share their group did in terms of the model? Go over here, David.
Well, we did each other's, and what we found was the invisibility. When we went to the ethnic origin, both of us just assumed we were one ethnicity, and then suddenly we found out that, oh, you have 2% African American, and I have 1% Native American. African. African. I did the ancestry. So, but that would not have come out unless the question was asked. And so our clients may present with hidden ethnicities and cultural influences.
Thanks, David. Thank you. Other folks want to add to that? So you can see this can be useful whether you're working with trying to understand colleagues better or clients as well. Just the areas we kind of don't think about sometimes asking or don't think about looking at are made more, I think, knowable, seeable in different ways.
Intersectionality, because they may go home and discuss with family members, with other friends, and they're going to give them this definition, and everybody's going to kind of look at them kind of like, where are you getting this from? And so I think there's a broader conversation to have about this particular piece. It's a very hot topic, not only academics but also social movements right now. And I'm just the way you were approaching it kind of makes me pause, because we don't want folks to walk out of this
much more critical perspective is what you're saying. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and we discussed that earlier. That there's two different ways to look at intersectionality, right? There's a more critical perspective, which is used in academia as better for a critical lens, which is what we need, which is what you're saying. And we're saying today is also the introspection perspective, which is kind of what we're focusing on today. With what you're saying, I much appreciate. You're absolutely right. We're not taking the critical race perspective, critical approach in this section. This is more again of a self-understanding and understanding others. But I really appreciate what you're saying too, and I really would agree to advocate to look at look at the more critical perspective on intersectionality. If you want to look at issues like race, policing, all these other social issues.
It's not necessarily, it's far more complex, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know, I guess it just we're just being very, very genteel with this particular topic. And again, it's just, there's a multitude of different discussions that could have walked out of all of this, and it's just making sure we're all on the same point.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In my class, we use a more critical perspective. Here, we only have one day, one shot. But I do appreciate that. Really good point. Anyone else want to bring up, either elaborate on what we just discussed or want to share what your group discussed? I'm going to come around this way.
It's more of a general comment. I think that the notion of intersectionality is just so helpful for the kind of society that we are living today. And I'm assuming that most of the people who came to this workshop are interested in the notion. What are the challenges you see in transmitting this notion of intersectionality to others who are not aware of it first, or who might have some resistance to embrace the level of complexity along all these different social positionings?
That's a great question. And this kind of brings on what the gentleman was just talking about too. I found that it can be, especially for people that come from those privileged backgrounds and haven't had to encounter pushback or challenges to that. I've had students break down crying, graduate students crying in class. We've had to talk separately. It can be a very difficult experience, especially someone who's more privileged, I think, to really look at some of these issues in the way they merit and deserve. That's why usually when I do this, I've used it as part of a class, and it's part of a year-long sequence we do in our program. It can get very challenging, but I think very beneficial for people too, especially people who are from the more the privileged side of things, to at least take this on. Yeah, so we'll talk out. We do this class. We do different exercises related to this in class. I'll talk privately with students sometimes, things like that. You have to be, I think, very careful. Sometimes some of them just, they need that push, but at the same time, it can be difficult. And if someone emotionally gets shuts down completely, you're going to lose them completely too. So it's a tightrope sometimes. Terrific. Thank you, though. Thank you for the question. Other questions or thoughts? Thank you both. Great points to both of you.
Mm-hmm. That's really the intersectionality. Is that race is going to amplify and magnify a lot of these other categories.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. It is. You can see even today we haven't gotten into it quite as much as I would like to, as I would ideally. But you can see even with a group like this, it still is that even though we got a pretty deep discussion going today, it's still at a rather superficial level in some ways. So you can just imagine the wider media content of that too. It's very difficult to talk about, but you're right. It's also glossed over very much.
I have a question. How do coping mechanisms and resilience come into this model?
That's a good question. Did everyone hear that question? How do coping models and the idea of resilience come in into the addressing model? Again, let me just reiterate too that the addressing model is different than intersectionality too. So let me make sure I mention that too as well. It's the addressing model is the person who conceptualized it from intersectionality, but they pulled away. It's a different model too. So I should just clarify that with some of the folks too. And going to what you're talking about with resiliency, it's really not, the way we're using the addressing model today, we're not really looking at it per se, but it probably should be included in some kind of manner. But it's not really addressed per se. Other questions? I think we're kind of winding down on time here right now. Had some great conversations today, though. I want to thank everybody for that. Certainly a discussion that we should have many more of, I think, as well. Yes, please. We'll see how things go here, Kane. But yes, thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate the comments, the feedback, the thoughts. And I just want to thank you all and have a tremendous day. Thank you.